Today on the channel we are going to be talking about this, the new Runcam Mipi camera that works with the DJI Digital FPV system. Now what we're going to do in this video is try to give you guys an overview of what the camera is, give you a little bit of footage and show you what it's like, and then I'll give you my thoughts about this camera towards the end of the video. I also need to explain what the situation is with this camera because it is made by Runcam. However, it is not an official DJI camera. Whilst it works, it isn't officially sanctioned by DJI or CaddX. We also need to explain what that means for the future as well, because whilst it does work with air units today, there is a real possibility it may not work with new air units that are going to come out in the future, and I'll explain a bit more about that towards the end of the video. Anyway, let's get on with taking a look at the camera itself first of all. Okay, so taking a closer look at the Runcam Mipi camera. Now this is a digital camera. Now the website doesn't state that it is out and out compatible with the DJI Digital FPV system. It does say that it will not work with SharkBite, but they don't really say what it will work with other than Raspberry Pi, but you've got to contact them on that. However, this camera does work with the DJI Digital FPV standard air unit as well as the CaddX Vista at this time. Now I am making that clear because there is rumblings that something might change on that, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on in the video. However, as you can see, once we've got the lid off the box, you'll find the camera in the foam on the side, and under here they include a Mipi cable for you as well and a couple of screws just in case you haven't got one. Now just getting that out the way and getting the camera out, as you can see, it is a small board camera style. You've got the main back of the camera there with the SoC, the Mipi connector down there, as well as just some other ICs. You've then got a nice little lens clap just to protect the lens, and there you can see the main camera module itself. Now the spec of this camera is as follows. It is a 2 megapixel sensor at 720p 60 frames a second. It features a 1.8mm lens with a field of view of 160 degrees, and it weighs 6.5 grams. Now this camera sits a little bit between all of the other cameras that we've got for DJI at the moment. It is not the same specification as the main original DJI camera, because the main camera does 1080p 60 frames a second or 720 120. The Nebula Nano does do 720p 60 frames a second. However, it's not the greatest of cameras from an image quality point of view, and it doesn't quite meet up to the same spec as the Nebula Pro, because the Nebula Pro is 720p 120 frames a second. Now, because it doesn't have the full support for the DJI system, it means you cannot adjust the camera settings via the menus on the goggles. You cannot use low latency mode either. So it doesn't have the option to set it in 4:3 or 16:9 or any of the other camera features like flipping the image and stuff like that. And it also doesn't have the low latency mode. That is exactly the same as the Nebula Nano. However, the Nebula Pro does have the option to have all of the camera settings like the DJI one. It also has the option to flip and low latency mode. You just don't have the 1080p mode on the Nebula Nano, unlike this one. Now there is one other camera that is available, which is the one on this, which is the new micro camera as part of the standard air unit now from CaddX, but that is basically a direct replacement for the DJI camera rather than being one of the smaller ones in the mix. Now as you can see, it is a bit bigger than the Nebula Nano, but it is much smaller than the original DJI camera, and what it is a nice option to have for CaddX Vista users, because the Vista doesn't have the built-in DVR, and you're not always going to want that ultra low latency mode. It would be nice to have it, but it is good to have this option. Now, the interesting thing about this camera right now is that it is available, because the biggest problem you will find with this DJI system right now is that you simply cannot get cameras for it. The only cameras that you can actually get is either with this air unit, or if you're lucky, random stock of the Nebula Nano or the Nebula Pro. But it's good that we do have availability of this camera from Runcam, even if it's not officially supported. Now, the next thing we're going to do is jump in and take a look at the image quality and just compare it to the Nebula Nano. I probably won't compare it too much to the original DJI camera because that still is the best camera overall, but that is a 1080p camera. And whilst I could compare that at goggles recording, I really think the market for this camera is against the Nebula Nano and the Nebula Pro, and I don't actually have a Nebula Pro to compare it to, unfortunately, but I think that's where the main market is, so that's what we'll take a look at the most. Okay, so to show you some footage from this camera, now I'm just going to compare it on the ground to the Nebula Nano from CaddX because this is the sort of category this camera does fall under. Unfortunately, I don't have a Nebula Pro to directly compare it to. As you can see, we've got the Nebula Nano sitting on the deck, and then we'll switch over to the Runcam Mipi, and the first thing you will notice is that the colours are a lot more washed out, but you do have that wider field of view. The overall image quality is definitely better on the Runcam, and latency is definitely less on the Runcam, especially compared to that Nebula that I showed just now. Next, moving just to show you some night footage. Now, this is less relevant today because we now have that new camera from CaddX as well, but it's just to show you in the workshop the difference between the two if you were someone that did want to go out and about with it in the dark. Next is just some footage whilst I've been out and about today, just to give you a bit of an overview of how the camera actually looks in flight. Now, this is just some basic straight flight, nothing spectacular, just some flight over some water and fields. Now, the first thing you will notice that when I got it set up today, I had it a little bit too far back in the frame, and because of that wide field of view on this camera, you can actually see the bars on the side, but don't worry, some extra footage in a minute gets rid of that. Now, something I did notice when I fitted this camera was the amount of jello I was getting compared to my previous camera, which was the CaddX Micro. I didn't really notice any on that at all. However, today on this, I was seeing a bit, and I have noticed it in a few other flights. It's nothing spectacular, but it does seem more susceptible compared to the other cameras. Overall, as I've mentioned, the latency is very good on this camera, and as you can see now that I've repositioned the camera, it looks a lot better, and overall it does a decent job of providing good image quality. It is only 720p, but it records okay, and this is direct DVR footage that you've got here. Anyway, I'm going to let you finish watching this, and then I'll give you my thoughts at the end. Okay, so first of all, to give you my thoughts on the Runcam Mipi. Well, overall, it's a fairly decent camera, okay? It is not the best, and it certainly isn't the worst in the list of cameras that are now available for the DJI system. Now, it sits about mid-table, in my opinion, just below the Nebula Pro. It can only do that 720p 60, which means it doesn't have low latency mode, and it's not going to be as good as the DJI FPV camera, the new CaddX Micro, or the Nebula Pro. However, it is better than the smaller Nebula models that we've seen, and in my opinion, it sits directly between the two. It has really decent latency, and it is lower than some of the other ones I've used as well, and the image quality is okay. It is a bit washed out, but it does what it needs to do. However, if you are someone who's looking for a camera for the DJI system for recording, then you do want to be getting either the DJI, not that that's available, the new CaddX Micro, or potentially the Nebula Pro, if again you can get hold of it. Now, as I've said, this camera sits mid-table, and I'm going to put up a list on the screen that shows the current supported cameras for the DJI FPV system. Whilst this one is on the end, in my opinion, it does sit above those Nebula cameras and really directly below the Nebula Pro. If you're after a replacement camera for the FPV system to replace those smaller Nebula models, or you're after something that you need to replace, this is well worth a look, because frankly, it's available. Most of the other cameras on that list you simply can't buy right now, and the best camera you can have for the system is the camera you can actually get, and this is one of them. It's not the best, and it's not the worst. Now, just to explain what the situation is with this as well, with the future and the info that we've had from CaddX that they're going to be encrypting their cameras. This camera, the Runcam Mipi, will continue to work with all of the air units that you have today, so the DJI air unit or the CaddX Vista. That is not going to change. However, it does appear CaddX are going to release an updated version of the Vista and possibly the DJI air unit that will require the camera to be encrypted, just like what Fat Shark do on the Shark Bite system. Now, this week CaddX launched a new camera called the Polar Starlight, and that is the first camera to actually support this new encryption. We don't really know yet if the early cameras are going to work with this. What we do know though is that the Nebula smaller cameras as well as this will not. So what the future holds for this camera is as follows. If you buy it today with your current air unit, you will be fine, but it may not work with new air units that come in the future. I do have one of these new Polar cameras coming, and as soon as it does arrive, I will share with you guys what I think about it. There are some really good reviews on that out there now as well. JB's done one, as has Albert Kim, so it is worth checking out. But I do have one coming in with a new air unit as well, but I don't believe the air units that you're currently getting today are encrypted yet. It's future models, but the camera is the first one to officially say that it's supported. So, should you buy this camera from Runcam? Well, my opinion today is actually yes, because it's available. And if you need a camera, then it is well worth a look. In fact, I'm going to go as far as saying if you own the FPV system, I would probably pick one of these up as a spare just in case, because there is a mass shortage of cameras for this system out there right now. And whilst that list does show that there are quite a few, actually being able to buy them is a completely different matter. There's rumors we're going to see a new Nebula Pro, maybe a version 2, because they can't make the current model, and we don't know what's going to happen with all of these other cameras as well as time goes on. Now, if you're interested in it, I will put a link to it in the description of this video. I want to thank Runcam for sending this one over to me. Overall, as I said, I think it's worth having one on the bench, so at least if you do break a camera, even if you've got the better ones, you've got something that you can replace it with. And don't think that they're going to be available all of the time, because we don't know what Runcam are going to do moving forward now that CaddX have announced that they're going to be encrypting the way the system works. Anyway, that's it for this one. Thank you for watching. I will put a link to that chart that I showed you in the description of the video as well. If you'd like to support the channels, there are links to Patreon as well as Buy Me a Coffee in there too. Only by you guys are supporting the channel are we able to keep making videos like this and hopefully share some info with you. Anyway, that's it for this one. Thank you for watching. Please do hit the subscribe button, and I will speak to you guys again soon.